it's a pleasure to have Yossi come back to TTI. He was here a few months ago, and he's back to give a talk today. Yossi has been a student at Berkeley for the last 2 years. He also is currently working at Meta, and before I think also worked at Google DeepMind. He has done a lot of very interesting work, and the topic he's recently very interested in is understanding deep learning models, and I think that's the main thing he's going to tell us about.
Thank you so much for having me. So today I'll talk about my attempts to interpret the inner workings of vision models, but I will start with a slide that I actually showed here the last time as well, which is that if you look at this field of computer vision in the past and in the future, in the coming days, you'll see very different behavior. If you look at the field in the past, you would see that researchers were coming up with a set of predefined filters, features, like gradients, like edges. They were applying that on the image to get a histogram of values. They maybe trained one linear layer on top of this histogram, and that was pretty much their algorithm for segmentation, classification, and a lot of semantic vision tasks. And what's nice about it is that it was fully understood, because all the parts of this algorithm were defined by the user, by the researcher. Now the problem is it didn't work that well, right? Now, if you look at the field today, what you'll see is a very different recipe. You see that people will come up with a huge data set, take a huge model, train for long enough, and they will get state-of-the-art results with deep learning, right? Now, the fun part about it is that these algorithms finally work. But the only problem is that we have no idea why, because we delegated the search of the specific features, the specific filters that the algorithm learns to the deep learning framework, to the search that the deep learning algorithms do. But the fact that this AI engineering finally gives us something useful, finally gives us models that we can work on and we can understand, we can use, opens up a new opportunity. Because if up until now we were only doing the engineering part, now we can also look at these models and try to understand what are they doing. So they finally work. And this is a very different type of research. It's much more similar to biology, which you look into these models and try to dig in and understand something useful about their structure. So what I will talk about today is my attempts to put these models under a microscope, right? I will have 3 parts. In the first part, I will look at individual models and we'll look inside the intermediate representation and we'll try to say something useful, something meaningful about the computation. If we go to this analogy to biology that biologists do on real neural network, this is some kind of lower dissection of the model. Looking inside the different computation and try to say something useful about what this weird organism is doing. In the second part, we will look at different models that have some connection between them. And try to say something meaningful about the relationships between models that were, for example, fine-tuned from the same source. You can, again, in this analogy to science and biology, you can think of it as genealogy, the study of families of models, right? And finally, I will look at what happens when we take these models outside of the lab setting, into the real world, in which nobody guarantees to us that the training distribution is similar to the test distribution, the examples that we will get at test time. Okay? By the way, if you have any question, feel free to just ask it during the talk. Okay, so let's start with the most simple case. Suppose that we have a classifier, classification network. It takes an input image and it outputs one of few classes, few categories. Right? Now, it's not actually a black box. It is a network. It is built of consecutive layers that are applied on the image to get the output. And what we would like to do is to look at an individual component, let's say an individual layer, try to analyze what's going on in it, what this layer is doing. And one naive way to do that is to actually look at the output of this layer. What is the output of this layer? It is basically a tensor that somehow corresponds to the image in its dimensions, maybe some resizing of the image in its dimensions. And the different channels, the different small images that I'm showing here, are the different activations of the different neurons in the output of this layer. Now, if you look at that, as you can see, you cannot say too much, right? You cannot actually characterize what this layer is doing because it does a lot of things and individual channels are doing a lot of things and it's not very useful. So what we actually want is a way to read out, to take some layer and decode it back to a language that we as humans can understand. Okay? So in 2020, when I was still at Google, we tried to do that. And the approach to do that was very simple. We said, let's invert this process. What do I mean by inverting this process? Let's, for a given layer, try to come up back with the input image that gave this layer, this specific feature that comes from this layer, right? So we take an input image, we ran through the model, we computed the outputs, just like I showed you before, and then we conditioned the model to reconstruct the original image. And it wasn't just a decoder. It was a generator. It was a GAN. It was a generative network that was conditioned on these features, the feature that come from this image. So by sampling different noises in the GAN, we were able to describe the different images that correspond to this feature that comes from this input. Right? So we were able to come up with a pre-image, all the images that correspond to the feature that comes from this image. And we didn't do it for one layer. We actually did it for all the different layers of the network. So we basically trained this model to reconstruct or generate a distribution of images that correspond to a specific feature. And we called it back then semantic pyramid. Why did we call it semantic pyramid? Because it gave us some semantic range, some continuum, from things that are very similar to the input image in the pixel, because they are very close to the input image in the distance from the input, to things that are very far from the image, already encoding a lot of semantic information, all the way to the last layer, which is pretty much the class. Right? So if you think if you look at the last image and the last traversal in the noise space, what you'll see is different images that pretty much correspond to this class of road. So we were able to say something about the behavior of this model, how much information is kept, and how much information is thrown, and how much semantic information is gained. Yes?
So theoretically, you could maybe try to get the same effect by, instead of generating, taking a very large set of images and looking for images which have similar activation.
Yes.
Other than efficiency, would it be kind of playing the same role?
Yeah, I think so. It's actually, what you're saying here is even brings me to the next point, which is a bug in this idea. The fact that we actually use another network, right? But if we just look at the nearest neighbors, we'll be able to find all the images that they correspond, but then we are somehow limited to the data set from which we start with looking for the nearest neighbors. But if you train a generative model, you're also limited because you also need to train this generative model on different images. So it can represent only part of the distribution. It can represent collapse, a lot of other things. Basically, we try to explain one black box with another black box, which is a problem. So in a follow-up, we try to explain features without scaffolding. And that's something that I presented here the last time that I was here, so I'll try to go over it quickly. But let's think of how can we explain feature without scaffolding. Well, one way to do that is to literally look at this activation that I showed you before and try to visualize them and maybe try to find correspondences to things or to concepts that we are familiar with. And people did it in the past. They were able to find individual neurons that fire around the areas of closets. They were able to find neurons that fire around faces of dogs and neurons that fire around plants, right? So they were able to find some structure, but it's very not scalable, right? Because it means that we need to know what we're looking for. And we need to go over many images, either with some additional network or manually, to say something about what this model or what this neuron is doing. So what we'll actually what we'll actually want here is a language to automatically describe it. We will be able to use some language like the visual language or some other language that will allow us to get something useful about these images in an automatic way. What language can we use? Well, visual language showing many images is one way, but it's not very compressed. Another language is called human language, right? If we were able to take a feature and to say, well, this is responsible for the edges of the left part of the image, that would be amazing. The problem is that these models do not speak in human language, right? There's multiplications of a lot of weights and inputs, right? So, but there is some types of models that do speak in in natural language. These are the models that include language in them. And one of them, as I showed here in the past, is clip. So clip, instead of outputting a class, it outputs a representation. What's special about this representation is that it lives in a joint image text space. So you can compare the image representation to a text representation. You can take the text wrote in the rain, have another encoder, text encoder that projects it to the same space, and now you can say if they are similar or not, according to the similarity in the cosine similarity between the representations. And as I showed in the past, this model is pretty good in classification as well, because you can encode the word house, encode the word road, and just find the one that is the nearest. So that gives us a pretty good classifier by itself, but also this model uses language. So what we did, and again I will go briefly about that, is that we look at the different parts of the architecture of Clip. You don't really need to understand what are the different parts. I will just say that there are two types of things. One is multi-head self-attention, and the other is MLP. And we try to analyze the different components. And we use the fact that the representation eventually lives in the joint image text space to do that. So we took an individual component, right, and traced its contribution all the way to the output. So you can think of it as computing the representation with this component being activated and without this component being activated, and looking at the difference. And because the difference, the contribution, is a difference of two vectors that live in the joint image text space, we can compare it to text. We can somehow characterize the behavior of this component, for example, on many images, with text representations. So that's what we did. We took specifically individual attention heads. Yes?
So how do you identify the set of text representations that you're going to query? So that's also not scalable, right?
So I will get into that. Yeah, it's a good question. So we took an individual component, an attention head, and computed the contributions on many images. And as I said, the contribution lives in this joint image text space. And now, returning to your question, how can we compare it to text? Well, we have ChatGPT. We can just ask ChatGPT to generate as many image descriptions as possible. We end up having 30,000 image descriptions that we can just run through the same model and compare, right? And not only do we compare, we maybe can characterize the behavior. So, for example, we can do some kind of quantized PCA, right? We can say, try to come up with a small set of text representations that explain most of the variance in the output of this individual head. So, just for explaining that, you can see that this vector explains most of the variance. It corresponds to this text, and this one explains the rest of the variance, so it corresponds to this text. And this way, for a given attention head, we can collect descriptions that describe the output of the head. And what's interesting is that when we did it, we were able to show interesting behavior. For example, for layer 21, head 11, we saw that the text words which this head is writing are things that are related to locations, like photo caption in Arizona desert, picture taken in Alberta, Canada, Rio de Janeiro. So we can characterize it as a geolocation. Here's another example, layer 23 at 10, image with 6 subjects, image with 4 people, things that are related to country. And we basically found a lot of structure in these individual heads. It was true for the last heads. I don't want to go into the details, I already presented it last time, but we were able to even visualize it. So given an input image, we were able to show what are the nearest neighbors to this image, not according to the final representation, but according to an output of a head that we think is a location head. And what we found is a lot of images, the nearest neighbors are images that are all taken underwater. And if you differently take a color head and look at the nearest neighbors according to this head, you will see a lot of images with yellow at the center and dark background. And here's one with textures, and you see this dotted texture behavior, right? Now, why all this is useful, right? So we can use it for reducing spurious cues. So suppose that you have you want to use Clip to classify images into land birds and water birds, and Clip, as many other models, uses the background as a spurious cue. So if you take this duck and put it in the middle of the forest, it will misclassify it as a land bird, although it's water bird. But we know that there are individual heads that are responsible about telling us about all these things that are in the background, location, geolocation, things that are related to that. So we can remove them, we can edit the model without any training, just by cutting some edges. And when we do that, we improve the classification. And it's not only for one model, but for various different types of model scales. Yes?
So, isn't there this assumption that these heads only carry location, nothing else?
So
What
this
is the compromise? Like, can you say something about if I am removing spurious correlations in one direction, is there a compromise that is happening in?
Yeah, so I believe that there is a compromise. It's difficult to say because I don't know how much of image, like how much do you need, how much background do you need to classify ImageNet images? Maybe the background is a significant cue, it's not a spurious cue. I guess that it compromises something. That's true. Just to finish with that, it's not that you can just randomly remove heads. You need to know exactly what heads to remove. Even if you just repeat this experiment many times, you will not be able to do the same performance. You will be able to improve a little bit because sometimes you will stumble upon a head that you saw. But yeah. Okay, and in a follow-up, we looked at nuance, the other part of the model. So if before that we looked at attention heads, now we looked at nuance. And it was just accepted widely, okay? So, and we know that individual, yes?
Sorry, good question. What was the top random column?
So it was a repeated, like basically we just randomly removed some of the heads, randomly chosen heads. We repeated this experiment 10 times and plotted it.
So if you repeat it infinite times, you'll get just as good results as.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so we basically did the same thing in a follow-up with nuance and looked at, again, basically traced the contribution of individual nuance all the way to the output. I will not say too much about what it's traced and how did exactly we do that, but eventually it's pretty similar, except that now we didn't even need to bother to worry about explaining the variance because it was pretty much, we could approximate the contribution of one neuron with one direction in the output space. So this problem becomes basically a sparse decomposition problem. So we took sentences and found a sparse set of words that, spans this vector. And you can see a lot of the same behavior. You can see that neuron 4 corresponds to snowy, frost, atherosclerosis, and ochride. When it is activated, it writes towards these words. And not only that, when it's activated, it is activated on these similar words, right? You see that it's activated on snow images, and frost images, and so on. Here are some other examples: woodworking, wooden, and so on. Gelatines, bubbles, cocktails, and you can see that it's activated on these images. Pretty much what you expect. But if you look a little bit closer, you will see that there are sometimes things that are unrelated that the same neuron is activated on, right? So the same neuron is when it's activated, it drives towards snow and atherosclerosis. And that's a phenomenon that people know as polysemantic neurons, right? The same neuron activated both on dog, elephant, value, cabbage, and so on. And not only that, it writes towards these sentences. Not only that it writes towards the sentences, it also fires for all of these images. Just a side note about biology and the human brain. Apparently, there was a debate in, 20 or 30 years ago about these individual neurons that captured individual concepts. People called it the grandma neuron. And people discovered later that, of course, there is no one neuron that detects your grandmother. There are many neurons, and the same neuron that detects your grandmother detects other concepts as well. So it's much more complicated than that. That's the side. But if you think
So there was all this stuff about Jennifer Aniston.
Yeah, it's the same.
That's been discredited.
Pretty much. Yeah. But if you think about it as not as a biological system, but as a software, right? You see a very bad implementation because you have the same variable capturing two unrelated things, right? If I implement in code, I don't want my function to detect both, dogs and elephants. I want different variables for each. So can we use that to fool the model? Okay, we use this phenomenon. So here's the thought. What will happen if I'll give this image to the model? Who thinks that this neuron will be activated on this image? Okay, great. Yes, this neuron is activated on this image. And when this neuron is activated, why? Because you see a dog and you see an elephant and you see a value sign and it's pretty sunny and so on. And when it's activated, right, what happens? It shifts the representation towards all of these words. It shifts the representation also towards the dog direction, right? Now, if you compare this representation to the word dog to the word cat, surprisingly, for this specific image, it will shift it so much that it will be closer to dog. So this image will be misclassified as a dog, although clearly there is no dog in the image, right? So what we created here is an adversarial example. Now, how did I create that? Well, pretty simple. I just took these words, asked ChatGPT to generate a sentence that has all of them except the word dog and instead has the word cat. So a cat lounging in the sun with a group of elephants in the background and a value sign in the foreground. And now I asked a stable diffusion or some other model to just generate this image. Now, all of this flow can be automated, right? I don't need to be part of the system. I can just give it to them, like generate many of those, and keep generating until I manage to fool the model. And surprisingly, we found some very interesting behavior. Almost every time that we put use banking, the words use banking behind the stop sign was misclassified as a yield sign, right? Or almost every time that we put a hockey stick next to a cat, it was misclassified as a vacuum cleaner, right? So that's a weird behavior, a semantic adversarial attack, not the regular one with a few pixels that flip the model, that caused this behavior because probably ChatGPT Clip was not trained on these examples, right? It never saw both the stop sign and the use banking at the same time, so it never needed to discriminate between the two, so we just used the same neuron for both. Okay. Yeah.
To what extent is it a failure of the framework that associates the entire image with one vector?
It might be. Yeah. Maybe it also might be because of the discriminative so-called nature of the task, right? You can always come up with some, shortcuts of using the same neuron for two things when you don't need to capture all the distribution. Okay, so up until now, I think most of the things I kind of showed you already, but probably when I told, yes.
So I just want to understand the methodology here. So these images, when you generated, if I understand correctly, you generated a sentence automatically.
Yeah.
And then you generated the image completely. So these images are not modifications of real images.
No.
They're just completely,
yeah. Yeah. I would guess that putting the text use banking behind the real stop sign will also work. But why didn't try it? It just is. Okay.
In the model you used I'm curious, the model you used for generating for generating the sentence, but mostly for generating the image. Did it have anything in common with the models?
No, so specifically we use models that do not have anything in common, but it will work also with models that are conditionally clear. Sometimes models can use the same components, but this one specifically is actually.
Thanks.
So that was one type of connection between language and vision that I presented when I talked about explaining individual parts of the model. Probably when I presented this idea of using text together with images, you were thinking about models like ChatGPT, right? If you care about taking this image and explaining it, you will not use one representation. You will just ask ChatGPT to describe the image. And what is this ChatGPT model? Eventually, it's a large language model. And it's a model that is autoregressively predicts the next word from the current state. So predicts M, A, large language, and so on. It just autoregressively predicts the next word. And eventually this model is a transformer, the same transformer. How this model can get images? So in some representations, the way that images are inserted to the model is very dumb. The way that it works is that we take an input image, we split it into patches, maybe encoded with some linear layer or some encoder, but eventually we just split it into patches. And then we give it to the large language models as if it was text. And initially, you do it autoregressively, you do not supervise on the output for the image part, but once you finish processing all the image, you will start processing predicting the next word. For example, the description of the image, if you ask for it. So you will start with A, cat, sits, and so on. So that's the way that some of these models work. But if you look at each individual component in this model, right, it's very similar to what we saw before. It's a transformer. In this case, it doesn't take an image, it takes a token, either a text token or an image patch, and just runs the same transformer blocks that I showed you before. It doesn't output a representation, it outputs a probability, a distribution over the next word. But we can repeat exactly the same process. We can take a specific component, and trace its contribution to the probabilities in the output, and see how much this component changes the output. And not only that we can do it on the text part, we can even do it on the image part, right? It's absolutely valid, although there is no supervision here. There is no real reason to encode anything useful in the output space here. We can take some individual layer, give take layer 19, give this token of a cat, and see what it is decoded into. And what we find is that it gives us some information about what is in the image. So we could say with high probability that there is a cat here, and with lower that there is sky, and with zero probability that there is a car, and so on. So we get some kind of internal confidence, some side channel here that gives us some information about what the model thinks about this image, even before it started to plot text, even before it started to generate text. Now, what happens if I take this image and ask the model to describe it? Usually what happens with these models, and you probably saw it if you played with it, is that initially it starts to say something meaningful. It says that there is a street corner, a stop sign, and so on. But at some point it starts to tells us about cars and trucks and things that are hallucinated that are not in the input image. But if we go back to the input image and use this internal confidence that I showed you before and ask about each patch in the image, do you see here a car? Do you see here a car? Do you see here a car? What you will get is that there is no patch in the image that has a car in a high probability because you don't see that, right? As opposed to a stop sign, that you have a stop sign somewhere in the image with a very high probability. So what we have here is that hallucinated objects have significantly lower internal confidence. And we can use this signal because if we can detect these cases, we can also remove them. We can steer the model to not talk about hallucinated objects. And we did it in the paper. We had some numbers. I don't want to go into the numbers. I'll just say that eventually we're able to reduce the amount of hallucinated objects in two different types of models, and just by using this internal consistency between what the model sees at the beginning and what the model starts to generate. Okay. Any questions?
Quick question.
Yes.
You project it from internal layer representations. You just multiply it with the output embedding space.
Yeah.
Oh,
Exactly. It's the logic lines.
so it's the same vocabulary.
Okay. Now, that's one way of looking at models, which is to look at individual components in models. But there is another way, which is to look at connections between different models and say something meaningful about the differences and the similarities between models. And specifically, if you look at models that are very similar to each other, for example, models that were fine-tuned from the same initial source, we can say something meaningful. So suppose that we have a model, a diffusion model, a generative model that takes text and generates images, and we fine-tune it on few images of one person. Right? Apparently, this model learns this person. If you have a special token that corresponds to this person, and you fine-tune the model for a few steps to reconstruct these images, now you can sample images of this person. You can say, token person with a red shirt, token person with a blue shirt. And you introduce a new concept to the model. Now, let's repeat this process many times. Every time we'll start with the initial pre-trained model. So we'll fine-tune it once on one person, and another time on another person, and another time on another person, and so on. And now we will create a set for each of these fine-tunings will give us a new set of weights that correspond to a new identity. So let's create a data set of this weight. Okay? And treat the weights and the space in which they live as a linear, we call it the weights-to-weight space. Okay? So if it's a linear space, we can even reduce dimensionality, we can do PCA, find the basis, and now we can start playing with the space. For example, we can sample from the space. And if we sample from the space a new point, that new point is a set of weights, right? So we can plug it back to the model. And when we sample from the model, we'll be able to generate an identity. This identity is not in the training data. It's not in the set of identities that are in the data. So you see that a linear interpolation, a sampling in the linear space of the weights correspond to a new identity, or an interpolation of identities in the output space. So you can ask this person to play tennis or have a dog and so on. Now, you can do other things. For example, you can find linear subspaces. You can apply an SVM, train a model, an SVM, that will split the space into all the identities that have appeared and all the identities that don't have appeared, right? And you will be able to find a linear separator. It's not that complicated. And it will work pretty well. It's a high-dimensional space. It's not very surprising.
Do you need labeled data
For this one, yes. Yes.
So it's not
It's not yeah. But I think that with even with PCA, if you look at the PCs, you will find some structure. You will find gender. You will find some. But we did it in a slow way. Yes.
What input are you running in the model with these modified weights? What input are you using for the model?
So we fine-tune the weights of the model each time on 5 images of a person to create the new weights of this.
You can create these data.
Oh, every time a different one. One is like a token person playing tennis, a token person playing, with a dog, a token playing person.
So there's different tokens or something?
No, the same token. There is a special token. Yeah. Okay, now, if you can find this hyperplane, you can take a model and cross the hyperplane. So you can shift the model weights in a direction that is orthogonal to the hyperplane. And what happens when you do that? You edit the model weights in a way that now you have a beard, right? Like now the model generates images that are almost the same identity, except that now it has a beard. And you can apply these edits one on top of the other. So, for example, you can start with a model and find the linear direction that splits between flat brows and not flat brows, and make the brows flat, and add bangs, and make the hair straight, and so on. And all of that in the weight space of the model. So you can sample more than one image of this person. You can sample many images. And then it's a very fine grain, right? They do not change the background too much. They do not change anything else. Most of the changes in the background is just because of noise. And you see that it doesn't change other identities in the image. So if I ask this person, this model to generate Obama, next to the person, Obama is not changing. Okay. What else can you do with this model? So you can take this model and invert an input image into that, even if it's an out of distribution image. So you can find the weights, you can fine-tune the model weights to reconstruct this image, but also live in the PC subspace, right? And when you do that, and you invert into the weights, now when you sample from it, you sample an identity that somehow is similar to the input image, right? So you can do it without a distribution inversion. You can start with, this image of Shakespeare, and invert it into the model, and then sample images of Shakespeare writing in a cafe with a tattoo, or with a red blue shirt and so on. You can even go to some movies, start with this up character, invert it, and generate it an image of this person or this person with a green shirt and so on. And you can go nuts with that. You can, even if you're familiar with this dogs that looks like the owners, you can start with a dog and invert it into the model, and you will find the owner that kind of looks like a dog, right? So yeah, that's another property that you can do. So you can get some kind of out of distribution behavior, or handling out of distribution cases by understanding something about the model weights. Now, I'm reaching the last point, the last part of this. Yes.
So the fundamental object here is this weight-to-weight space, and you create it by fine-tuning a bunch of models on identity. So it's kind of a common. You decide that will build different people.
Yes.
What happened? First of all, have you tried it on anything other than people's identities?
Yes.
So dog breeds, which
yes, we tried it. It works well on things that have like 2 dimensions of the general concept of dogs or cars, for example, and the subcategories, the different breeds of dogs, the different types of cars, and so on. And you can still find interesting directions there. So you can find a wavy fur. You can find the size of the object as one linear direction in the outer space and so on. With cars, you can find color and how old is the car, how old is the car, and so on.
So if I do half, 100 models on people identities and 100 models on cars, what will happen?
I don't know, but I would guess that it will not work as well. I think it works well on subdomains and things like that. We're not yet in this regime of working at the general. So
is there a way to characterize more precisely what is the underlying assumption about what's common to these tokens?
Yes, I think characterizing it will be difficult. I think that if there is some inherent similarity in the general concept there, but it's vague.
It's a visual similarity.
It's a visual similarity. Yeah. I'd say that maybe with larger training data, basically more models that we can collect. Here we collected 60,000 models. Maybe with more models that we'll collect, we can even do it on larger or more diverse data sets, but I don't know. It's just an assumption. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. The stable diffusion models are trained on lots of diverse indoor or outdoor scenes, and they generate really well.
Yeah.
This set of images looks very not so hard, very specific, and so on.
Yeah.
How about doing on hard examples?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I would be happy to try that. I don't think I don't have an intuition. As I said, I think that with more data it might work. But it's also about the fact that the model can learn a new identity, a new concept from few images. So if it is able to learn a new dog from few images, it is able to learn a new person from few images. I don't know what is the equivalent in the large. Anyway, I hope it answered your question. Okay, so the last part here, I called it escaping the lab, because up until now, yes.
Is there a way to provide a guarantee of some sort on what concepts cannot be edited together? Suppose I'm editing 2 concepts like curly hair and maybe a vague scale or something.
Yes, so
can your subspace tell me that okay, if I do that, that might really make the image quality poor, or that cannot be done at all?
I think you can. Yeah. We didn't do that, but I think that if there are correlated concepts, we will not be able to, separate that. And given that, with some notation, you can just find the correlated concept in the model. That's okay. So the last part, escaping the lab. The idea is that up until now we talked about models, in the lab setting, in which we knew what data they would get, and we showed some results of auto distribution, just like the dogs, like the inversion that we showed before. But in general, if you think about the premise of deep learning is the idea that the training and the test data have the same distribution. And we know that in the real world, it's rarely the case. Now, we as humans know how to handle it very well, right? If images from Russia, if you go to the real world and it's summer or fall or winter, you're still able to handle all of these environments with your single brain, right? You can still handle and adapt to all of these cases. So why can't model do the same? Why can model be prepared at the same time for every different distribution shift? Why can they put, take an umbrella and put shorts and so on and be prepared for all the distribution shifts? The answer for that is that there's basically infinitely many possible distribution shifts, right? If you take this famous data set of, for quantifying the robustness of models, you see, 15 different distribution shifts, including JPEGs, pixelate, noise, blur, and so on. But you can, of course, think of, even for this case, you can think of any combination of every two, right? So you already have 2 to the power of 15 without even thinking, right? But eventually, the capacity of the model is limited because the number of weights of the model is fixed, right? We cannot change the model, or we use a model that is not changed when we evaluate on a new distribution shift. So the idea that we have is, instead of being ready for everything, instead of being ready for all the possible distribution shifts, let's adapt the model to the current test example when it arrives. Okay? What do I mean by that? Let's take the weights of the model, and when we get a new image, fine-tune the model a little bit on this image to improve the performance of this model. Now, where is this provision coming from, right? If we have the test image, we don't have the annotation. How can we take gradients with respect to the to update the weights, right? And the main idea here is that we can use self-supervision. Specifically, we use master autoencoding. What is master autoencoding? It's a very simple technique. You just take an input image, remove some patches, and try to reconstruct back the original image, and you have a loss an L2 loss, a reconstruction loss between the input image and the output of the network. And it turns out that this already gives if you fine-tune it with an encoder and decoder structure, and then freeze the model, it already gives you good enough representations for many tasks. So you can freeze the model, learn a linear probe on top of it, or some probe on top of it, and that gives you a very good classifier already. But what happens if you have an image that is out of distribution? That's a noisy image. So we said, okay, let's continue training the model on this image. Now, again, we cannot take gradients to the classifier because we don't have the class, we don't have the annotation, but we can take gradients with respect to this self-supervised task. And when we do that, we update the encoder. And when we update the encoder, we'll now run the updated encoder on the input image, and then run the fixed classifier on top of it, and we will get a classification. And it turns out that as the reconstruction loss goes down, the correct class accuracy goes up. And that happens across many different distribution shifts. So if you take all these examples that I showed you before with all these different corrections, and you look at the original model, it's okay on some of them, it's not that good on all of them, but now with this additional test time compute, with the additional training on this specific task, we actually improve the performance just by spending some more clocks, some more compute on this task. Yes?
How much more compute?
So we did it so this is 20 steps on one image. So for each image, we take this image, we run 20 steps of the model, of fine-tuning the model.
So what's that wall clock time?
I don't know. It's like less than seconds. It's nothing too expensive. Again, if you care about a specific image.
Using different masks each time?
Yeah, we just randomly in something. Yes.
Do you try to train the model to reconstruct the original uncorrupted image or to reconstruct?
No, you don't have the uncorrupted image. You only have the corrupted ones. You don't want to assume that you know what is the distribution shift. You just assume that you have one hint, one example of the distribution shift. Just to finish up, it's better than previous methods. Then in the follow-up, and that's like in 2 sentences, In the follow-up, we did an online version of it, in which we start with a model, we fine-tune it, we make a prediction, and then we use the updated weights to go to the next frame. Then we fine-tune it a little bit more, make a prediction, and so on. Here, the prediction wasn't a classification, because classification is not very interesting in the video domain. We did segmentation. So we fine-tuned the weights with this MAE, master encoding, made a prediction, moved to the next frame, fine-tuned, make a prediction, and so on and so on. And it improved the results a little bit. So before that, the segmentation was not that good. For example, you can see here, one frame and the next frame, and in one frame you see the road, and in the next frame you don't see the road. The model doesn't see the road. Now, when we do this fine-tuning and continue training the model, we get better results. And numerically also. Yes.
Do you, maybe it's kind of besides the point, but do you know what happens to your ability to classify other images as you become more and more attuned to the image at hand?
Yeah, I think you probably get worse in that. It makes sense that you will get worse. Like the regret will be not good, but it doesn't matter because you can continue training. When you get a new image, you can continue training on that. You train on this one. So there is a trade-off here. In this paper, we actually showed some trade-off of forgetting and that. But yeah, basically, of course, we'll probably forget something about the initial. Just one sentence about a version of that. Yes, version of that with 3D. It's very natural to do this test time adaptation in 3D. We as humans do it all the time. Suppose that you get an object and you want to predict how does it look like from a different, from the other side. You can predict, but you can even use a diffusion model that takes a relative camera and predict, and it will look very bad because you actually don't know what's on the other side. But as you get more and more images from different views, like a baby that plays with an object and start looking at that from different views, you improve your understanding of 3Dness of the object and how does it look from different sides, from different angles. And we showed that you can basically, as you get more images, you improve your 3D model of this specific object. We even call this paper, the more you see in 2D, the better you can see in 3D. And of course, with number-wise, we'll also improve the numbers as you see more images. Okay, so some takeaways, and then I'll say one sentence about future work. So up until now, we saw that we can interpret the individual roles of internal representations, neurons, weights, other parts of the models. And not only that we can interpret them, but we can find useful computational components that can be reused for new applications, or can be changed or modified or edited to improve existing behavior, and all that just by understanding the computation. And we can even adapt the internal computation to test examples with this test time compute to improve performance. By the way, this idea of test time compute becomes hard nowadays with all this O1 and all of that. The approach is a bit different, but even with the simple approach of fine-tuning on the training, on basically the test example, you can get an improvement. And people showed it, I think that Jacob Grass group showed it on this ALC data set that everyone's so excited about. Okay, so few words on future work. I think that in general, what I want to do is to look, my main goal is to be able to take a model, set of weights, and input model, output algorithm. Of course, it's a very big request. I don't expect that this algorithm will fully describe the model behavior, but I would like to get some guarantees about how much I can explain with a relatively simple algorithm about the real behavior of the model. So saying something like with 85%, I can explain 85% of the behavior of the model with these few lines of code. And maybe find some bugs in this code, or say, okay, these are the possible examples that can improve the result, the training and so on. That's the general question. But there are a bit more specific things to do. So specifically, I'd really like to look at interpretability not at the test, at the end of the training, but during training. I detect why do individual neurons, capture more than one concept. Is it partially because of the data, the training data, is it because of the initialization of the network? What are the sources of this behavior? And if we can find the sources, we may be able to debug it, right? So we can use it. We can use this test time detection of model bugs, like I showed you before with this one, to feed it back to the model and continue training with it. And this way, we can maybe improve the model in a continuous way. And finally, I really want to apply these techniques on superhuman models, on models that perform better than us in specific tasks. So this is an example from Kim Bin's paper, Kim Bin's lab, in which she took a deep neural network that plays chess much better than humans, the AlphaZero, and then she applied very similar techniques to what I applied for vision, but she applied it on understanding the decision making in chess. And she took this understanding and applied it back to expert players. And apparently it improved the expert players, it improved their performance. So you can gain some understanding, and if you apply it not only on these chess examples, but on real cases in which models will perform better than humans in astrophysics data or biological data or medical data, we can actually automate scientific discovery. With that, I would like to say thank you, and of course, thanks to my amazing collaborators, and Alyosha is my advisor. If you have any questions, please feel free.
We do have time for a few questions.
Yes.
So I'm interested in this use of test time compute. So language models, your test time compute in language. Do you think that would be a competitor for your test time compute application? Generating language about the thing.
I think that the word works again from Jacob and Andreas group, a group that did pretty much what we did, but on the text. So they just took the prompt, the question of a specific, I think it was ANC, a data set of tries to measure intelligence, and they basically fine-tuned the model on the prompt, directly, trying to predict the next word in the prompt. That already improved the results in LLM, in the way that LLM works. That's the general idea. I think there are other attempts in LLMs that include, for example, a critic, so a model that kind of captures all the possible, like you can generate, like one model generates all the possible solutions, and another one criticizes according to what they think is better, and just continues with one that was the best. And that's what O1 and O3 collaboratively use. This is a bit different. It uses another model on top of it. Has some understanding, some word model understanding, right? Like it knows something about what the model, what is a good answer and what is a bad answer. It's not always the case. It assumes something about that.
I guess my question is about
chain of thought.
You're using a gradient. Right?
Yeah.
In chain of thought, you're just generating.
In context, yeah.
Would those compete?
I think that they compete, but they can. I think that each of them gives some. Like, it's a good question. I'm trying to think if somebody showed that they are complementary. I think that they are complementary each other in many ways. I would guess that they are complementary each other in many ways, because it's two different mechanisms. One of them is some kind of internal gradient descent that the model does implicitly, and the other one is like explicit gradient descent that the model weighs. I think that it will give different results, and maybe together it's more. Yes.
Can you give a bit more intuition about why you think test time training with masked autoencoders work would help test accuracy?
With what?
Why would it help?
Would it help?
Help
accuracy.
I think that it learns better representation. Just for out of distribution examples, it maybe we were just discussing it. We don't know, but maybe brings the representation to be closer to the in distribution counterparts. Maybe not. It's something that we can test with this like interpretability methods. But the intuition here, to be honest, I don't have too much intuition about why does it work. But I would guess that if that would be a good answer. If I'll find some behavior. Yeah. Question.
Right. Last question. So I guess maybe a bit open, but how do we make all of these approaches kind of future proof in this? Like, how much of a change should occur in the way we do machine learning to make these approaches obsolete, and then, or maybe at this point anything we do is going to fit this pattern? Or you need this in your own network, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I will assume for a second that we're still doing gradient descent some version. It's a good question. I think what we found is that maybe I have one slide to show that.
It's an excellent question.
It's an excellent question. What we found is that yes, a lot of models have the same representations or very similar ones. You can find a neuron in all of these models, from generative ones like StyleGAN to MAE and Dino and Clip, all of them. They all have a neuron that captures the red hat of the cat, or the nose of the cat, or the contour of the object, or the eyes, right? So it seems that it's something global, not about the architecture or about the task, but
about the signal.
Something about the signal. So I hope that it will give us some understanding about what are the basic blocks that we can look for, at least for the vision domain. I think that for different domains, we'll probably come up with different basic blocks of in robotics it can be a gate, right? How do you walk, and the joints and so on. In language it can be the different parts of the sentence and so on. But eventually, once you define that, I think you will be able to see that even in more advanced models you will see a similar behavior. And it's a question of why. That's why I want to look at this interpretability during training. I think that it emerges at some point. Maybe we can put our hand on when does it emerge and why does it. But yeah, it looks like it works. Can work in that part, hopefully.
Right. With that, thank you again.